In the last few days, I've got to spend some time with a new game coming out, Expedition 33. And if my time spent with the demos any indication, we're in for one hell of a ride, even if we don't understand like 50% of it. Developed by French studio Sandfall Interactive and published by Kepler, this turn-based RPG takes not only the turn-based stylings that you may expect, but adds in some real-time mechanics with an eerie French-inspired dark fantasy world, and then smash it all into a turn-based strategy title that also has real-time components. And that's precisely why this may be on the right track, because it's actually wrong to think of it as a mishmash. It's dropping on April 24th for PlayStation 5, Windows PC, and Xbox, and I got a chance to sit down with it and play many hours, so let's check it out. And now's the time I'd tell you to subscribe, but no, don't. Instead, go check out some smaller channels you may have watched and not hit the subscribe button, especially the way YouTube works. It always helps. Imagine waking up one day to see a number scrawled across the side of a giant mountain like some celestial death warrant. If it happens to match your age, tough luck, you're gonna die. That's a grim fate humanity suffers every year at the hands of an enigmatic force known as the Paintress, an eldritch executioner with a brush instead of a blade, and has the world at her beck and call. With every passing cycle, entire generations are wiped clean like ink spilled on old parchment to be thrown away. And now, as the dreaded 33 shows up, one last desperate gamble set into motion where an expedition goes out to try to destroy her. And this expedition is led by Gustav, played by no less than Charlie Cox from the Daredevil TV show. You join up with other characters, a mix of warriors and scholars and rogues, characters that are voiced by Jennifer English, Kirsty Ryder, and Andy Serkis. Each of them carries on a reason to fight and help you out and tries to defeat the Paintress before the inevitable 33 turns into, well, basically 32. Their odyssey is really no simple march. It starts out in the middle of the story. It spans across different haunted sea-like locations, drowned ruins, and landscapes that are all twisted into eerie reflections of many different fantasy settings and games overlapped on top of one another. And every bit of the world you explore sort of peels back that mystery of past failed expeditions and different stories about what's happened in the past, existential choices, as well as the team's resolve and their understanding of one another and why they're fighting for this. And speaking of who's fighting, you are with Gustav, you take other characters with you, and you explore the world, which is actually surprisingly vertical. There's a lot of places where you're climbing up using grapple locations where other teams have used it to try to find new story elements or fight enemies. And fighting enemies is something you do a ton of in the demo and in the real game itself. When you jump into a battle, it's what you would expect. On the left, you have your character portraits, which say who goes first, who goes last, and then you have your turn-based battle system. When you're playing, you have to sort of figure out when it's going to require a turn-based action where you can sit back and do nothing, and the next moment when it's going to require you to press a button. It's about picking moves from a menu, as we've seen in all turn-based games, and then watching those numbers fly out, nailing a perfect parry or dodge when it's required of you by hitting that button exactly when the enemy attacks. There's even a free aim system in this that lets you actually aim a gun that zeroes in on enemy weak spots. So if you've ever wanted to snipe a demon's kneecaps, you can do that. Each character, no matter what they had or what they were doing, had an almost fiction built around them where it made you start to believe that the classes, or at least the character archetypes, made a ton of sense. Whenever you do something in a game, it costs action points, and while you gain one per turn, there's a lot of ways different characters can actually squeeze out extra AP, or you can get some from good parries or skill chain, specific maneuvers you choose, making you hit a button while an indicator on the screen quickly plays out, maybe something that people are accustomed to at times. But the way this game goes about it is distinctly different. You can also go into the actual settings of the game and at any time turn those on to automatic, so it'll handle it for you. There's also relics that function like the RPG's answer to pretty much wearable cheat codes. You equip one of them and that'll give you a ton of stat points. And you find these around the game world. You stack the right ones together and you can fine-tune your party's play style. What I found with this was when I experimented with the different characters, there were actually distinctly different ways to play the same character, not only depending on just your upgrade path, but also on the way you put points into the different attributes like vitality, might, agility, defense, and luck. And they raise things like attack, power, speed, defensive abilities, and critical hit, respectively. This is the kind of combat system where every decision does feel like it matters, even if you don't really want to engage in the real time. It is something that if you jump in there and use it, you get enough bonuses from doing it. It can be the difference between life and death. And it actually feels like something that works fairly well. There were a couple times where I felt like, why in the hell is this one system not actually asking me to enter a real-time input. It's just there were a couple skills that didn't do that, which seemed odd. Especially at the starting of the game, I was always wondering, okay, which one of these is going to require a button press and which one isn't? And then once you sort of figure that out, it's not so bad. What I did like also is how each character, as I said before, has an almost class-style feeling for it. For example, one character has offensive stances that they switch into, and it gives different bonuses. Another character casts spells, and while doing those, they gain something on their spirit called stains. It's almost like wounds for an old-style D&D monk, which you can then use to power other moves, but they're elemental-based, so you might actually end up getting a stain of flame on yourself by casting a flame spell, and to use it, you sort of burn that flame off and you cast an ice spell with it, which may seem odd, but it almost feels like, in a way, to remove that heat from yourself, you create an even deeper cold feeling, and that's what you cast on the enemy. The main character was the more standard shoot shit, slash shit, magic attack shit, and then move on kind of character, but that actually solidified the gameplay group. We have a character you can pretty much understand instantly, and you know exactly what's going on, even when you add on different weapons and their skills, but the side ones were where the juice was. You can also switch and attack any character in the lineup that you're facing with some massive modifiers. For instance, floating characters can actually usually dodge up-close attacks, completely meaning you have to plan out the magic attacks to hit them, while another character may be almost impervious to a particular element, things we've seen before. But when it's their turn to attack, you can basically dodge or parry, with parrying able for you to deliver massive bonus damage back to them. I can say that the input system for this did feel a little odd. That large box on the screen with an arrow on it, I thought, okay, I need to hit the button right when the box lights up, and the arrow sort of matches up with the countdown design. But that resulted in a number of misses. In fact, sometimes it would say perfect, regardless if I felt it was perfect or not. Now, the setting, as I said before, is equal parts, let's say, opulence and nightmare fuel feel, but not in that, oh, look, we're at an art museum kind of way, more like what would old French design colliding with Elder Gods horror feel like. Enemy design was the same way. It's all over the place. At first, it was like Stonehenge got pissed at those people trying to graffiti it, so the rock sprouted legs, bad attitudes, and tried to defeat you. And then the next, you'd be fighting a Pinocchio-looking automaton, and then a foresty, rocky ogre. As I continued playing, I started to think I figured out why. We'll just have to see. With these worlds and these hubs, I would say it's one part almost Final Fantasy, another part undersea theme park. You'll move through an alien location that has warped Alice in Wonderland styled motifs, and then ocean scenes where, as I said, water bubbles up into the sky. There's cracks in the ground, and one point in the game there is a whale swimming or floating or flying above your head. It is this eclectic, ethereal feel to the fiction that ended up paying off dramatically, especially as I sort of looked around and said, you know what, these mysteries, these little bits of story I'm finding are pulling me forward in the demo, which I didn't quite think was going to happen. Now, the sound sphere is wide, almost distractingly so when you're playing, so especially when traipsing around in underwater sections where ambient sounds, creature calls, and your own footsteps can become almost confusingly wide, like the center channel isn't necessarily doing all it needs to ground the character in that space. There's a lane here of effects, one on top of the other, that really delivers that otherworldly feeling. This also tightens up into a fine space when you go into combat, with attacks, dodges, and blocks all centered pretty expertly. Also, this might be some of the best music I've heard in a demo ever, and I mean ever. The otherworldly melodies, they sort of resonate hand in hand with the visuals. You have angelic vocals fading into harmonies that sounds like they're almost from childlike instruments. Things that you don't usually hear in games, especially this eclectic. The soundtrack so far is very off-kilter. It's something that you might expect from a number of games actually mixed into one. There are elements of titles like Fable, Final Fantasy, Kingsbird, and others. I've enjoyed the soundtrack a great deal. But I did have some concerns. First, when it comes to control, which is mouse-based movement systems or controllers, it sees you moving the mouse a huge amount before it makes an impact on the character's controls, which is what really matters in third person, and it feels more clumsy than it needs to be. They had a warning, hey, we'd like you to play on gamepad. That feels the best in this game, at least right now, and I jumped to it, but it still felt somewhat the same way. Also, the awful free aim gun in the combat. I love the idea that you can do it, but it feels almost completely 100% disconnected from everything else. The way way you aim, the way it looks, even the way it animates. The game's worldview and batshit story don't help that part of it, but also when you switch out to that free aim, you're just sort of sitting there going like, why does this feel like nothing else in the title? Also, when it comes to animation for movement, it's not only floaty, but also pretty rough, especially starting and stopping, which aids the feeling of these characters appearing on their own, almost like puppets. But it makes movement feel weirdly unresponsive on both the mouse and keyboard and on the controller. And there's no maps in exploring the areas, which can suck when everything looks like you drained 20 miles of the Pacific and you're walking around coral beds. Lastly, the game's atmosphere is very thick, and at times this means the world has a smudgy, smoky look. The game doesn't always put its unique and interesting visuals forward because of that look. It almost looks like the bloom is set way too high on it. And when you're playing the game, there are times where you realize this would look great if I could, sort of see it all. The game also has an open world map. So this is hearkening back to the RPG days of yore, where you go into a large open world map and you can explore. We've seen a ton of it and I got to run around in it. I like that overall, but at this time I really haven't seen how that reflects the main game proper yet. So far, I think they're pretty close to nailing this. We'll just have to see if they can make it through to the very last days. If the preview is anything to go by, though, Expedition 33 is shaping up to be something that's at least visually striking with some good gameplay chops, with possibly a couple misses. The blend of turn-based and real-time elements does give everything a frantic feel almost, that then is combined with the momentary relaxation of sitting back and just watching the turn-based combat happen. That, to me, is almost unsettling and, in a good way, intriguing. I'm actually excited to see where this title goes. That's it for me. I'd love for you to subscribe, hit the patron button, jump on over there. We have awesome discussions in there, or you can just become a YouTube member, or you can do none of those and give this a thumbs up and leave a comment if you like these videos. Peace out.
68. Elodie's expedition.
You know the commanders of every expedition.
Expedition 68. Their boat was blown into the air by a storm. Lumiere lost sight of it, but assumed they crashed on the continent.